Welcome to the impact of the tech antitrust bills on consumers. I am Trevor Wagener, Director of Research and Economics at the Computer and Communications Industry Association. I am joined today by Varian, Chief Economist at Google. Thank you for joining us, Hal.
Thank you for inviting me.
A number of antitrust bills targeting tech companies have been introduced in the current Congress. The measures in these bills largely originated as policy recommendations in a report published by the House Committee on the Judiciary's Subcommittee on Antitrust in October 2020. They include a number of prohibitions targeted at leading online platforms that exceed specified size thresholds. The relevant legislative proposals include, but are not limited to, the following provisions: non-discrimination requirements, structural separations and line of business restrictions, and prohibitions on mergers and acquisitions. Hal, can you walk us through the implications of these provisions?
Sure, Trevor, happy to do so. So the House Antitrust report recommended implementing rules to prevent discrimination, favoritism, and self-preferencing, which inspired the so-called American Choice and Innovation Online Act. The non-discrimination provision would effectively require covered platforms from showing any apparent preference for services or products that are offered by the platform operator. So in practical terms, this would be a significant barrier to offering an integrated user experience, as it requires that users make additional clicks to select among alternative services, whereas most users would rather navigate directly to their desired service. Now, likewise, there's a subsection that entitles, that's called Reducing Conflicts of Interest Through Structural Separations and Line of Business Restrictions, and that was inspired by the so-called Ending Platform Monopolies Act. So the structural separation and line of business restrictions would effectively force covered platforms to separate the currently integrated services and prohibit a platform operator from entering new markets. So structural separation would not only massively degrade the user experience, but also directly reduce competition by preventing operators from competing with incumbent firms outside of each service's core market. So finally, subsection entitled Reduce Market Power Through Merger Prescriptions recommends provisions found in the so-called Platform Competition and Opportunity Act. The merger assumptions will make it nearly impossible for covered platforms to acquire venture capital-backed startups, which would reduce exit opportunities for startup founders and venture capital investors and discourage the startup formation. So acquisition by a larger firm is the exit strategy for the majority of successful startups, and most founders and venture capital investors actively seek these acquisitions. For example, there are currently hundreds of venture capital-backed startups that focus on machine learning and artificial intelligence. So neither the founders nor the venture capitalists are under any illusion that the mature market will have hundreds of independent firms at the leading edge. Instead, most hope to develop useful products that can add value to existing services and ecosystems if and when acquired.
The natural question that follows then is, what is the basis for these proposals? The House Antitrust report claims that the digital economy is less competitive than it once was, and this has resulted in higher prices, reduced product quality, and reduced innovation and entrepreneurship. Hal, do you agree with their assessment regarding purportedly higher prices, the first claim?
Clearly, these are aggressive policy proposals that could have a significant negative impact for consumers and thus the whole startup ecosystem. So, for example, just as a kind of interesting application, look at this slide, which is an advertisement from Radio Shack. When is it? 1991, I think. No, yes, 1991. 15 electronic gadgets being sold by Radio Shack in 1991. Well, now 13 of that 15 are now on your mobile phone. And if you think about a mobile phone, it's a really remarkable device It's a substitute for a camera, a GPS, a landline, a game machine, an ebook reader, a computer, a movie player, audio player, map, fitness password generator, fitness monitor, alarm clock. I could go on and on and on and on. They've integrated all of those capabilities into this single device. And that's what consumers want. They want an integrated device that allows them to do a variety of different things using the same hardware and software. And if we decided to go back to the old model of search, for example, 9 blue links, 10 blue links on the page, no information, nothing much for the user to click through to get additional comments. And it's really a situation that would be a vastly inferior product if you're required to avoid any kind of integration, which seems to be what the House Antitrust report is doing.
In light of the significant consequences that you've outlined from these proposals, it's worth asking, where are they coming from? What is the basis of these proposals?
Well, Section 3 in the House Antitrust report lays the groundwork for these policy proposals, and they discuss a number of purported problems in digital markets that the policy proposals intend to address. But the factual basis for these purported problems is questionable. So first of all, there's a claim about higher prices, but that's directly contradicted by empirical evidence in the academic literature. There are plenty of studies that show prices are going down for these digital products, not up. And many digital services are completely free to consumers. Free to use services by definition don't involve price increases for consumers. And if you look at the prices of products, then the empirical literature shows that online prices have been declining over time. For example, the Adobe Digital Price Index created by Austin Goolsbee and Klenow show that the prices for categories of goods sold online have declined significantly more rapidly than the prices of equivalent product goods sold offline. Indeed, inflation has become a prominent concern for Americans, the stated top domestic policy in the current administration, and evidence continues to mount that one of the best ways for consumers to find the best prices is to make greater use of online platforms and utilize marketplaces that allow consumers to easily compare prices and products. That's the way you get low prices, making it easy for people to do those comparisons.
Now, the House Antitrust report also claimed that product quality has been harmed. How do you respond to those claims?
Well, research shows that consumers prefer the convenience of integrated experiences, as I just indicated, and digital firms are constantly innovating to enhance that user experience. Remember when what your favorite digital services looked like just a few years ago, and look at where they are now? The quality improvements are undeniable, I think, both in terms of ease of use and of navigation.
The House Antitrust report also purports that innovation and entrepreneurship have been reduced in recent years. So to respond to that, what is the current state of innovation and entrepreneurship today?
Well, 2021 was a record year for startup funding, twice as high as the previous year, 10 times as much as a decade ago. And most startups expect to be acquired. There's a nice survey from Silicon Valley Bank that illustrates what founders believe will be the eventual outcome for their startup. And if you kill the market in acquisitions, you're going to reduce the incentive to become a startup in the first place. So it's a great example of unintended consequences. You make it hard to exit, you're going to make people reluctant to enter. And if you look at the big tech firms, most acquisitions, are very small and very young. Both the FTC and the UK competition note this fact. So a great example is to look at Android. It was 2 years old when acquired. It only been working for a year on its actual product. They started out doing a operating system for online photo collections and decided it was a much bigger problem. You needed a whole online operating system. They had 8 people, only 4 software engineers have been working, as I said, for about a year on the project. Now, of course, when they were acquired by Google, Google added hundreds of engineers and billions of dollars to take that vision that they had at Android and turn it into reality. And that's a very, very common framework. You have a small firm that understands a market, that creates a product that's useful to consumers, and then they're acquired by a larger firm to actually get to market and make that available to consumers.
Very interesting. Now, the House Antitrust report also makes a number of claims about concerns regarding market structure. In particular, the House Antitrust report claims that the digital economy has winner-take-all dynamics, such that one firm often comes to dominate a given market, and that this results in market concentration and even gatekeeper power for large firms. How do you respond to the first of these claims about market structure? Does the digital economy cause winner-take-all dynamics?
Well, there's constant competition within the digital economy, and the notion that firms can persistently dominate without fear of competition is ridiculous. You can just look at some of the failures over the past 20 years and see that it's a highly dynamic industry. Facebook and Netflix, for example, their stock prices have decreased about 50% since last fall due to this aggressive competition. Innovative new consumers are constantly being founded and funded by venture capitalists and foreign governments. So efforts to act as an aggressive gatekeeper are just to invite disruption. The only way to become and to remain a leading firm in any market niche online is to constantly be innovating. You have to put users first, build the products and services that consumers want. So the House Antitrust report spends very little time on addressing the core concern of modern antitrust, which is consumer welfare. And this is because the real focus of the House Antitrust report is about protecting less efficient firms from competition, not making sure that consumers get the highest quality services at the lowest possible price. So firms operating the digital economy, by contrast, must always keep the consumer welfare at the front and center in order to remain competitive.
Now, how do you respond to the second set of claims, namely market concentration can lead to gatekeeping power for leading companies?
Well, I say Google is not a gatekeeper, but a guide. And that's what most of these products are like. They're guiding you to some useful service that consumers find attractive to utilize. Now, there's a number of claims in the House report about how difficult it is to compete with Google. Well, yeah, it's hard, but that's because Google spent billions of dollars improving search over the last 20 years. They're still spending a huge amount of money. 16% of Google's revenue actually goes for research. That's why the products are constantly getting better. Nobody else comes close to that amount of investment that Google has done. Now, Carl Shapiro and I wrote about this 20 years ago in our book called Information Rules. And if you look at the early work that people have done looking at concentration, they've used the economic census. Now, the trouble with the economic census, it only includes the U.S. firms. It does not include foreign firms operating in the U.S. It does not include imported goods. Yeah, if you throw away a significant amount of the competition from imports, it looks like there's concentration, but it's just not really there when you look at the actual dimensions of competition in these industries. The economic census ignores those inputs by law. I mean, it's not just they'd like to include them, but they can't demand those figures from foreign firms. When you include the import in foreign firms, there's no increase in concentration. So look at the New York Fed report on the U.S. market concentration and import competition, and you'll see the details of that claim. In fact, they conclude, once the sales of foreign exporters are accounted for, market competition was stable between 1992 and 2012. So is Toyota a competitor for Ford? Yes, you bet. And if you look at, is TikTok a competitor for YouTube? You bet. So of course they are. And that's only increasing because the level of activity from these foreign firms is trying to follow the Silicon Valley model and are creating products that are essentially going to be competition for the domestic companies in these areas. Now, when a new technology comes along, the companies who first learn to master that technology can grow very, very rapidly. Think of Ford in the assembly line, or Edison in electricity, RCA on television, and so on. These firms were very, very successful initially, but then you have some technology transfer. Other firms learn how to master this new technological capability, and there's a lot of entry. So look at Neva, nice example. It's a search engine created by one of Google's former top engineers, left Google, alas, we miss him, but started a competitor for Google. And it took him just 2 years to go from a vague idea to an operational search engine. And I think we're going to see more of that happening in the future.
Now, the House Antitrust report also claims there are barriers to entry in the digital economy, including, for example, economies of scale and scope, as well as data, which may reduce competition. Now, how do you respond to these claims about digital barriers to entry made in the House Antitrust report?
Well, take a look at this slide, and it has a little summary of the House Committee on Entry Barriers. And if you look at the venture capital industry, the fact that they're funding so many startups shows that this conclusion from the report is just plain wrong. There's constant competition, and economies of scale and scope are not problems, but really opportunities for innovation. Other firms have access to this too, not just the incumbents. And the scale and scope efficiencies allow for high quality service to be offered at a low cost to billions of users, and thus improve both consumer welfare and overall productivity. Now, with respect to data, leading firms have used data to inform business decisions for over a century. This is not unique just to the technology industry. If you have any smarts at all, and you've got a new firm that can gather data about what consumers are interested in, what alternative cost structures there are, all sorts of ways that you can utilize data about your industry, your firm, to actually become a successful entrant. So there are a lot of industries that exhibit a return to scale. One of the key characteristics of information goods is they are expensive to produce, potentially, but cheap to reproduce. So think of a movie. It costs millions of dollars to create the movie. It costs basically nothing to create another CD or a streaming video of that movie, or a book, same way, an operating system, a computer game, a database, on and on and on. Information goods are everywhere. You know, people used to talk about the information economy. Now it's the digital economy. Actually, the old description was more informative because you can look around and find information goods everywhere. They can be licensed for uses. They can be priced by subscription, rolled out over time, like a serials we see coming now, ad supported. So markets could deal with the economies of scale and scope. There's now a whole sector of the economy and GDP calculations called information, and it's kind of joined its brethren, even though it's a relatively new entry in the GDP tables. It's been around for at least a century, and probably much more, depending on how you count. And finally, if you look at the role of data in search engines, it's widely misunderstood. What you did last year, last month, last week, that's not very helpful for a search that's being conducted now. What matters most is what you did a minute ago, or a half a minute ago, or a few minutes ago during your search session. They can be informative, the data from the session. The data from months ago, not really useful for anybody. And this is why you see these reminder ads so often about products you browsed recently or in the last few hours or the last few days. And those ads, by the way, don't really use data from the search engine. They're using data from the merchant about recent visits to its websites. So it's a different source for that information. If somebody walked in my store and looked around and then sauntered out, I might think, there's a potential customer. Maybe I'll see if I can get him to stay. Well, it's the same thing for online customers. They visit your site, click around, showing some interest, maybe not ready to buy. That's when you want to show them a reminder ad. And that's what we see happening with most consumer data.
Very informative. Now, Hal, in your view, how has the House Antitrust Report led the bills it inspired astray?
Well, the bills inspired by the House Antitrust Report all aim to protect inefficient incumbent competitors rather than consumers. The purported problems identified by the House Antitrust Report generally do not hold up to empirical scrutiny. Bills seeking to solve non-existent problems make for poor policy, and that's what we're seeing in this case.
And with that, Hal, thank you very much for speaking with me today and shedding some light on these issues.
Well, thank you, and I hope our viewers found today's discussion illuminating. And you can find more analysis of the House Antitrust Report and the anti-tech bills in the URL that we're just displaying. So thanks again for watching.